It's one of those stories you hear as a kid. A whole colony of people, more than 100 of them just gone, or vanished. It sounds like something out of a ghost story. 1 minute they are there, on an island off the coast of North America, building a new life. The next, nothing. Just an empty settlement and a strange word carved into a post. The CROATOAN. So, did the Roanoke Colony just disappear into thin air? The short answer is no. People don't just dematerialize, but the real story is messier, more human, and maybe even more interesting than a simple ghost story. It's a story about ambition, bad timing, desperation, and the collision of two very different worlds. To get what happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Not just to their disappearance, but to why they were there in the first place. This all started in England in the late 1500s. Queen Elizabeth I was on the throne, and England was a rising power, but it had a rival. A big one, Spain. Spain was the global superpower. They had conquered huge parts of the Americas. They had gold and silver pouring in from their colonies, making them rich and powerful. England looked at Spain with a mix of fear and envy. They wanted a piece of that new world pie. A man named Sir Walter Raleigh was one of the key players. He was a favorite of the Queen, a classic Elizabethan adventurer. He was ambitious, charming, and he had a big idea. England needed a foothold in America, a base. From this base, they could do a few things. They could look for their own gold and resources. They could provide a new home for England's growing population. And, maybe most importantly, they could use it as a base for privateers. Those were basically government-approved pirates who would raid Spanish treasure ships on their way back to Europe. It was a Cold War, and this was one of the main battlegrounds, so Raleigh got a charter from the Queen. He had the right to colonize a huge swath of the American coast. He called it Virginia, in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. But Raleigh himself never went. He was the promoter, the money man. He sent others to do the dangerous work. The first real expedition to Roanoke Island happened in 1585. This wasn't the lost colony yet. This was the practice run, and it went badly. About 100 men, mostly soldiers, were sent under the command of a tough, rigid military man named Ralph Lane. They built a small fort on the north end of Roanoke Island, a strip of land protected by the outer banks of what is now North Carolina. At first, things seemed okay. The local people, Algonquian-speaking natives, were curious. 2 men from a nearby island, Manteo and Wanchese, had even been taken to England on a previous scouting trip. Manteo was fascinated by the English. He saw them as potential powerful allies. Wanchese was more suspicious. He saw their technology, their guns and ships, and he worried they would bring trouble. He was right. The English colonists of 1585 were soldiers, not farmers. They didn't really know how to grow their own food in this new environment. Their plan, it seems, was to have the native people feed them. This worked for a little while. The local tribes, like the CROATOAN, traded with them, but 100 extra mouths is a lot to feed, especially when those mouths belong to armed men who don't seem to be doing much work. The supplies the English had brought with them dwindled. The welcome from the natives wore thin, and things got worse. The English way of dealing with problems was often with force. Ralph Lane was a military man, and he was paranoid. He started to believe the natives were plotting against him. A silver cup went missing, and Lane's men accused a nearby village. The English reaction was brutal and completely out of proportion. They burned the village and its cornfields. This single act of violence poisoned the well. The local tribes, led by their chief Wingina, turned from cautious hosts into enemies. They refused to trade food. They started picking off stray Englishmen. The colony was starving. The men were on the brink of mutiny. Just when things seemed hopeless, a fleet of ships appeared on the horizon. It was Sir Francis Drake, another famous English sea dog, returning from a raid in the Caribbean. He offered to help, to leave them a ship and supplies. But a huge storm blew in and ruined that plan. Lane and his men had had enough. They were tired, hungry, and scared. They abandoned the settlement, hopped on Drake's ships, and went home to England. That was the first attempt. A total failure, but it provided crucial information. A scientist named Thomas Harriot and an artist named John White had been with the colony. Harriot studied the native language and customs. White painted incredible watercolors of the people, the plants, and the animals. They brought back knowledge. The main lesson should have been obvious: you can't survive by bullying and depending on the local population. So you need to be self-sufficient, and you need to build real relationships, not ones based on intimidation. They decided to try again. This time, Raleigh and his backers had a new plan. No more military outposts full of soldiers. This would be a real colony, a civilian settlement. They recruited families, men, women, and children. The idea was that people with families would be more invested in making the colony work. They would build homes, plant crops, and create a permanent piece of England in the New World. The artist from the first trip, John White, was appointed governor. This was a good choice. He wasn't a soldier, he had a gentler disposition and had already spent time trying to understand the native people. He was also personally invested. His own daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias Dare, were among the colonists. The plan was to settle in a new location, not Roanoke Island, with its bad history and shallow water. They were aiming for Chesapeake Bay, further north. It had deep harbors and was thought to have better soil. Around 117 people set sail in 1587, but things went wrong almost immediately. The fleet was commanded by a pilot named Simon Fernandez. He was a skilled mariner but had his own agenda, likely related to privateering. He was in a hurry to get back to the Caribbean to hunt for Spanish ships. When they reached the Outer Banks, Fernandez refused to sail them north to the Chesapeake. He claimed it was too late in the season. He basically forced John White and the colonists off the ships at Roanoke Island, the very place they wanted to avoid. It was a disastrous start. They were in the wrong place, a place where they had already made enemies. They found the fort that Lane's men had abandoned. It was overgrown. The houses were still there, but the place was desolate. They had no choice but to try and make it work. They started repairing the settlement. A few weeks later, there was a moment of hope. John White's daughter, Eleanor, gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the Americas. It was a powerful symbol, a sign of a new beginning. But the old problems quickly returned. The local tribes were not happy to see them. A colonist named George Howe was found dead, shot with 16 arrows, while he was out crabbing by himself. Fear gripped the small community. White knew he needed to reestablish some kind of relationship with the natives. He turned to Manteo, their one reliable friend. The English formally made Manteo a lord of his own island, CROATOAN, as a reward for his loyalty. White tried to make contact with the mainland tribes who had killed Howe. He wanted to talk peace. But his men were angry and wanted revenge. They launched a night raid on a village where they thought the enemy warriors were. But they got the wrong village. They attacked a group of CROATOAN natives by mistake, people who were their friends. They killed one and wounded others before they realized their error. It was another terrible blunder. They had managed to alienate the only friendly tribe in the area. The colonists were running low on supplies. The season was late and they hadn't been able to plant enough food to get them through the winter. They were isolated and surrounded by people who had every reason to hate them. They realized someone had to go back to England for help. For more people, more tools, more food. They decided it had to be Governor John White. He didn't want to go. He had just become a grandfather. His whole family was there. He argued that if he left, people back in England would think he was abandoning his post. But the colonists insisted. They put their request in writing. They promised to look after his family. Reluctantly, he agreed. Before he left, they made a plan. If the colonists had to move from Roanoke Island, they would carve the name of their new location into a tree or post. If they were in distress or had been forced to leave, they would carve a Maltese cross above the name. With that understanding, John White sailed for England in late August 1587. He promised he would be back by the following spring. He had no idea it would be 3 years before he saw Roanoke Island again. White arrived in England to find the country in a state of emergency. Spain was preparing to invade. King Philip II had assembled a massive fleet, the Spanish Armada, to sail to England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth. Every available English ship, big or small, was being commandeered for the war effort. There were no ships to spare for a supply run to a tiny, distant colony. White was frantic. He tried everything. He petitioned the Queen. He pleaded with Raleigh. He even managed to get 2 small ships in the spring of 1588. But their captains were more interested in piracy than a relief mission. They got into a fight with a French ship, lost their cargo, and limped back to England. The chance was lost. Then the Armada came. England was locked in a life-or-death struggle. The fate of the Roanoke colonists was the last thing on anyone's mind. England won, of course. The Armada was defeated by a combination of English naval skill and bad weather. But the war with Spain dragged on for years. It was almost impossible for White to find a ship and a crew willing to make the dangerous transatlantic journey. Finally, in 1590, he managed to get passage on a privateering expedition that agreed to stop at Roanoke on its way home from the Caribbean. It had been 3 long, agonizing years. Imagine what must have been going through his mind. He was about to see his daughter and his granddaughter, Virginia, who would now be a toddler. He was about to be reunited with his colony. As the ships approached the Outer Banks in August 1590, they saw smoke rising from the direction of Roanoke Island. A good sign, they thought. The colonists must be there, signaling them. They anchored and prepared to go ashore the next morning. That night, the men on the ship sang old English songs and sounded trumpets, hoping their countrymen on the island would hear them. There was no answer. The next day, White and a group of sailors rowed to the island. The smoke they had seen turned out to be just a forest fire. As they neared the place where the settlement had been, White's heart must have been pounding. He saw the place, but no people. The settlement was gone, not destroyed, but dismantled. The houses had been taken down. The whole area was enclosed by a strong defensive wall, a palisade made of tree trunks, which hadn't been there when he left. It looked like the colonists had fortified their position before they left. On one of the main posts at the entrance to the palisade, he found a word carved in capital letters CROATOAN. He searched everywhere. He found some heavy iron bars and lead shot half buried in the weeds. He found 4 small cannons that they had buried. But he found no people, no bones. No signs of a battle or a struggle. It was just empty, silent. He remembered their plan, the carving of their destination, CROATOAN. That was the name of Manteo's Island, about 50 miles to the south. Today we call it Hatteras Island. And, most importantly, there was no Maltese cross carved above the word. This meant they had not left in distress. It was a signal that they had gone to CROATOAN Island voluntarily. White was relieved. His family and the other colonists weren't dead, they had just moved. He now knew where to find them. He went back to the ships, ready to sail south to CROATOAN. But the sea had other plans. A great storm rolled in, a typical late summer hurricane for that coast. The winds howled. One of the ship's anchor cables snapped and they almost wrecked on the shore. The captains of the expedition, who had already made their money privateering, were not willing to risk their ships or their lives any further. They had fulfilled their promise to stop at Roanoke. They refused to go to CROATOAN. White pleaded with them, but it was no use. The weather was too bad, the season was too late. They turned the ships around and sailed for England. John White was forced to leave, knowing his family was likely just 50 miles away. He never got another chance to return. He died a few years later in Ireland, never knowing for sure what happened to his daughter, his granddaughter, and the colony he was meant to lead. And that's where the mystery begins. The colony wasn't lost in the sense that no one knew where they went, and John White knew exactly where they said they were going. The mystery is why no one ever followed up. Raleigh sent a few search expeditions, but they were mostly half-hearted and distracted by other goals. The English were more focused on their next colonization attempt, which would eventually succeed at Jamestown in 1607. The Roanoke story just faded away, so what actually happened to them? They didn't just vanish. Over the years, several major theories have emerged. The most obvious and most likely theory is that they did exactly what they said they were going to do. They went to CROATOAN Island. They were running out of food. Their only real friend, Manteo, was from there. It was the logical, safest place to go. They probably packed up everything they could, dismantled the houses for the wood, and sailed down the coast in a small boat, a pinnace that White had left with them. They settled among the CROATOAN people. Living with a native tribe would have been their only real chance of survival. The CROATOAN could teach them how to fish, hunt, and farm in this new world. Over time, the English colonists would have integrated. They would have married into the tribe. Their English clothes would have worn out, replaced by deerskin. Their language might have slowly blended with the local Algonquian tongue. Their children would have been raised as members of the tribe. Their English identity would have slowly, generation by generation, faded away. They didn't disappear, they were absorbed. There is some evidence for this. Over 100 years later, an English surveyor named John Lawson explored North Carolina. He spent time with the Hatteras Indians who lived on the same island that had been called CROATOAN. He wrote that these people claimed to have ancestors who were white. He noted that some of them had gray eyes and lighter hair, features not common among other tribes. They even knew some English words. This isn't definitive proof, but it's a strong clue. Then there is the archaeological evidence. In recent years, archaeologists have been digging on Hatteras Island. They have found English pottery, pieces of guns, and other European artifacts from the late 1500s mixed in with native artifacts in the same village sites. This shows that at least some English people were living there with the CROATOAN at the exact right time. It's the closest thing we have to a smoking gun. A second theory is a variation of the first. Perhaps the colony split up. The word scro was found carved on a tree away from the main settlement. Maybe this was a sign that a smaller group went inland while the main body went to CROATOAN. The colonists knew that the Chesapeake Bay area was their original destination. Some of them might have tried to make their way north overland. There are stories from the early Jamestown colonists that support that. Captain John Smith, the leader of Jamestown, wrote that the great chief Powhatan told him about people who dressed and lived like the English. Powhatan said he had attacked and killed most of them because they were living with a rival tribe. He even showed Smith some iron tools that he claimed had belonged to them. This could account for some of the colonists, but it's a secondhand story from a man who had every reason to want the English to fear him. It's hard to know how much of it is true. A third theory is that the colonists were massacred. This was a popular theory for a long time. Maybe a hostile tribe, angered by the earlier actions of Ralph Lane's men, finally took their revenge. Perhaps Wanchese, the native who had returned from England full of suspicion, organized an attack. Or maybe the Spanish found the colony. The Spanish considered the entire coast their territory and saw the English colony as a threat. They had wiped out a French settlement in Florida a few years earlier, but there are problems with the massacre theory. John White found no signs of a fight at the fort, no bodies, no burned buildings. The dismantling of the houses seemed orderly, not like something done in a panic. And if they were attacked, why would they leave a neat carving pointing to CROATOAN Island? It doesn't quite add up. It's possible they were attacked after they left Roanoke, either at CROATOAN or somewhere inland, but the evidence at the settlement itself doesn't point to a violent end. A fourth theory is that they simply succumbed to disease or starvation. A harsh winter, a failed harvest, or an epidemic could have wiped them out. This is certainly possible. Life was incredibly hard for early colonists, but again, it doesn't explain the carving. And it doesn't explain the lack of graves. If 117 people died of disease, you would expect to find a burial ground. None has ever been found. Finally, there's the theory that they tried to sail back to England on their own. They had a pinnace, a small but seaworthy boat. Maybe they grew desperate waiting for White and decided to risk the journey home. A storm could have easily sunk such a small vessel in the vast Atlantic. This is a clean and simple explanation for why they vanished without a trace. But it completely ignores their primary clue. Why carve CROATOAN if you're about to sail in the opposite direction? It makes no sense. So where does that leave us? Did they disappear into thin air? No. The story of Roanoke isn't really a mystery of disappearance, it's a mystery of what happened next. All the credible evidence points in one direction. The colonists, facing starvation and abandonment, made a rational choice. They left their vulnerable settlement and went to live with the only people who might help them, their allies, the CROATOAN. They weren't lost. They were found by a native community that took them in. Their story likely didn't end in a dramatic, violent tragedy. It probably ended quietly as they assimilated into a new culture, trading their Bibles for local traditions and their English clothes for animal skins. The story of Virginia Dare, the first English child, probably didn't end with her death, but with her life as a CROATOAN woman, her children and grandchildren growing up as members of the tribe. The romance of a lost colony is powerful. It conjures images of ghosts and unsolved riddles. But the likely reality is more complex and far more human. It's a story of failure, the failure of England to support its people. It's a story of cultural collision with both its violence and its moments of cooperation. And it's ultimately a story of survival. The Roanoke colonists survived. They just didn't survive as English people. They survived by becoming something new, by blending their world with the world of the people who were there long before them. The real mystery is not where they went, but how much of their story, their DNA, and their legacy is still woven into the landscape and the people of North Carolina today. That's a puzzle we are still trying to piece together.